When my father spat the words, "You're not even her real granddaughter," something inside me cracked. We were standing in Grandmother Eleanor's study, the air heavy with the scent of leather and old paper, the same room where I'd spent countless hours as a child listening to stories about family legacy and duty. Her portrait loomed above the fireplace, serene and dignified, as if silently judging what her death had unleashed. My grandmother had been buried only 3 days ago, and already the family was tearing itself apart over her fortune. My father's voice was full of venom. Only blood relatives deserve the Blackwell inheritance. His words echoed against the oak-paneled walls, cruel and deliberate. I could barely manage a whisper. "What are you talking about?" He smiled then, not a kind smile, but one of triumph. "Don't play innocent. Jennifer, your mother's little secret isn't much of a secret anymore." I stared at him. The man I had spent 27 years calling Dad. The man whose approval I had chased through every school award, every life decision, every attempt to prove I was worthy. And now, he was saying I wasn't his daughter at all. He turned toward grandmother's portrait. Eleanor was obsessed with bloodlines. "Once the lawyer confirms you're not a true Blackwell, you'll get nothing, not a cent." I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Do you promise," I asked quietly, "that only blood relatives will inherit her estate?" He straightened, proud and arrogant. "Absolutely. I'll make sure the Blackwell legacy stays with real blood, not imposters." Those words would become his undoing. I left that room trembling, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out my thoughts. My name was Jennifer Blackwell, or at least it had been until 5 minutes ago. Now I wasn't sure who I was. The family I thought I belonged to suddenly felt like strangers. My phone buzzed a message from my mother. "We need to talk about your father tonight. Alone." I stared at the screen, a cold unease crawling up my spine. Whatever truth she was about to tell me, I knew it would change everything. That evening, I met my mother at a small cafe downtown, her favorite place. One she said helped her feel like an ordinary person, not a Blackwell wife. When I walked in, she looked pale, fragile even, her usually perfect hair undone, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "She didn't waste time. I never wanted you to find out this way," she said softly, her hands trembling as she turned her wedding ring. "Your father was cruel to throw it at you like that." "So, it's true." My voice cracked. "He's not my biological father." Tears gathered in her eyes. "It's complicated. Jennifer, more complicated than he'll ever admit." She told me everything in slow, painful fragments. When she was young, she'd fallen in love with James, my father's younger brother. My uncle. They had been inseparable, dreaming of a future together. But when James received a prestigious research fellowship in Seattle, they decided to part temporarily. The distance strained them, and during that time, Douglas, my father, had been waiting, patient and calculating. One night, she whispered, I was lonely, confused, and he was there. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness I regretted immediately, but when I discovered I was pregnant, James was already engaged to someone else. Douglas proposed right away. It seemed like the right thing to do for you. My mother's confession left me breathless. Every piece of my childhood rearranged itself in that instant. My father's disdain, his endless criticism, his cold indifference. It all made sense now. I wasn't his, and he had known all along. But why now, I asked, my voice shaking. Why tell me this after all these years? She looked at me, her expression hardening. Because your grandmother's will is being read next week. He's terrified she left you something significant. He's trying to discredit you before that happens. Her next words cut deeper than anything before. But he made one fatal mistake. She said, You are a Blackwell by blood, Jennifer just not his. You're James's daughter, which means you're Eleanor's granddaughter by blood. I sat there frozen, the weight of irony sinking in. My father's attempt to cut me out of the inheritance by denying our blood connection might actually prove that I was the only true heir by his own logic. What do I do now? I whispered. That depends on what you want. My mother said gently, Revenge justice? Or simply the truth? The next morning, I drove to my Uncle James's apartment. My hands shook on the steering wheel the entire way. How does one tell a man that he might be your father that his brother's entire life has been built on a lie? James welcomed me warmly. As always, his apartment was modest, filled with books, scientific journals, and souvenirs from his research trips. There was something calming about the space, something real, human, untainted by the cold elegance of the Blackwell estate. "You seem troubled," he said, pouring tea for both of us. His eyes, deep brown, gentle, and strangely familiar, studied me with quiet concern. "I need to ask you something," I began, the words catching in my throat. "Did you and my mother ever, before she married Douglas?" The teacup froze halfway to his lips. He set it down slowly. "Why would you ask me that now?" "Because Douglas told me he's not my biological father, and he's using that to challenge my place in grandmother's will." For a moment, James just stared at me. Then something shifted in his expression. Shock, realization, and finally, a kind of quiet sorrow. "I never knew," he said finally. "Catherine never told me she was pregnant. By the time I found out about the marriage, it was done, but I always felt something toward you, Jennifer, a connection I couldn't explain." He exhaled deeply. "If you think I might be your father, then we should know for certain." We arranged a private DNA test that day. It felt surreal. Almost clinical swabs, forms, signatures, yet the stakes couldn't have been higher. The results would arrive in 72 hours, just before the will reading. While waiting, I contacted my grandmother's personal lawyer, Bernard Walsh, hoping to learn what Eleanor had truly intended. He was kind but cautious. "I can't discuss the contents of her will before the official reading," he said. "But I can tell you this: your grandmother was exceptionally clear about her wishes. She believed fairness wasn't always defined by blood." His words gave me hope. But that hope shattered later that evening when I received an official letter. Douglas's lawyer, Harrison Mills, had filed a petition to delay the will reading, citing identity concerns among beneficiaries. He was moving faster than I'd expected, pulling strings I didn't even know existed. And when I called Bernard's office to confirm, I learned he'd been hospitalized with pneumonia suddenly, conveniently, and would be unavailable indefinitely. My mother's voice trembled when she called that night. "Douglas knows you met with James. Be careful. Jennifer. He's more dangerous when he feels cornered." 3 days later, the DNA results arrived. My hands shook as I opened the email, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely see the words. Probability of paternity 99.99. It was undeniable. James Blackwell was my biological father. I called him immediately. He sounded both relieved and heartbroken. "I always suspected something," he admitted quietly. "You have Catherine's kindness and my mother's eyes." For the first time in my life, I felt a strange peace. The truth had finally chosen me. But the victory was fragile. I knew Douglas would never surrender easily. And I was right. When the call came from Harrison Mills, I almost didn't answer. His voice carried the same oily confidence I remembered from every family gathering, the tone of a man who thought he was always one step ahead. "Jennifer," he said smoothly, "I think we should discuss a possible resolution before the will reading. It's in everyone's best interest." Every instinct in me screamed trap, but curiosity and perhaps a need to see the enemy up close won out. "I'll be there," I replied. His office smelled like old wood and expensive cigars, a place designed to intimidate. Harrison greeted me with a thin smile, gesturing toward a chair opposite his mahogany desk. "Douglas is concerned," he began, sliding a crisp document toward me. "He asked me to extend this offer on his behalf." I didn't even need to read it to know it would be insulting. Still, I scanned the page. "Waiver of inheritance rights. In exchange for a one-time payment of $250,000. I laughed a small, incredulous sound. "You're serious?" Harrison steepled his fingers. "Jennifer, we both know your claim is shaky. You were listed in Eleanor's will under the assumption that you were Douglas's daughter. Now that the truth has come to light, the truth, I interrupted sharply, is that I'm still Eleanor's blood granddaughter. You and Douglas are the ones terrified of that fact. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty, maybe even fear. Then it was gone, replaced by that polished calm again. There are complexities in the Blackwell Trust, he said carefully. Certain clauses that could render everyone's positions precarious if examined too closely. Douglas wishes to avoid that. I leaned forward, my voice steady. You mean he wishes to avoid exposure? His silence was answer enough. I stood, sliding the paper back toward him. Tell Douglas I'm not for sale. As I left his office, the first chill of autumn wind bit at my cheeks. The world outside felt sharper, clearer, as if the fog that had clouded my life for years was finally beginning to lift. The next morning, James called me. His voice was tight, urgent. Jennifer, he said, I've learned something you need to hear now. My stomach twisted. What is it? He hesitated. Douglas isn't who he says he is. He's not biologically a Blackwell. I nearly dropped the phone. What are you talking about? James exhaled shakily. A nurse who used to work for our parents reached out. She told me that Douglas was adopted as an infant. Our mother couldn't have children after several miscarriages, so they took him in quietly. Then, years later, she unexpectedly became pregnant with me. They kept Douglas's adoption a secret. They didn't want him to feel less than their son. I pressed my free hand against my chest, my heart thundering. If that's true, then Douglas has no bloodline claim at all. Exactly, James said. By his own logic, the one he's using against you, he's the one disqualified from the Blackwell inheritance, not you. The irony was staggering. The man who had spent his entire life preaching about blood purity and legitimacy was, in fact, not even born a Blackwell. Does he know? I whispered. I don't think so, James replied, but Eleanor might have, which would explain her cryptic behavior and her private meetings with Bernard Walsh. Everything clicked into place, grandmother's secretive comments, the way she'd always looked at me with a mixture of affection and sadness, and her parting words, trust your instincts, Jennifer. Not everything is as it appears. There was a chance she'd known the entire truth all along and had crafted her will to ensure justice would reveal itself in the end. What do we do with this information? I asked. James's voice softened. That depends. Do you want to punish Douglas? Or just make things right? I thought about my father, no. About Douglas and all the years he'd made me feel small, unworthy, less than. His cruelty wasn't just emotional, it had shaped my entire self-image. He'd broken me piece by piece until I stopped trying to earn his love. Now, he was about to learn that the one thing he valued most, his name, his lineage, his power, had never been his to claim. I want him to face his own truth, I said quietly. I want him to choke on it. The morning of the will reading arrived like the calm before a storm. Grandmother's mansion, usually warm and dignified, felt colder than ever. The air hummed with tension as relatives gathered in the formal dining room, cousins, uncles, aunts, all dressed in somber black like crows waiting for a feast. Douglas sat at the head of the table beside Harrison Mills, his posture straight, his expression smug. My brothers, Thomas and William, flanked him, both looking uneasy. My mother sat beside me, her hand trembling slightly as she held mine under the table. Harrison began with his usual pompous formality. Before we proceed with the reading of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwell's will, I must address certain complications regarding the eligibility of beneficiaries. Douglas leaned back in his chair, satisfaction radiating from every inch of him. Indeed, he said smoothly, it's come to our attention that Jennifer is not my biological daughter. Therefore, she does not meet the requirements set forth by the Blackwell Trust. Whispers rippled around the room. My pulse roared in my ears, but I forced my expression to remain calm. Douglas slid a folder toward Harrison. I have DNA evidence proving she is not of my blood. I stared at him. How did you even get my DNA? He smirked. From your glass, at our last family dinner. A chill ran through me. That's illegal. Perhaps, he said, his tone dismissive, but it's also conclusive. Harrison nodded gravely. The science appears sound, regardless of the method of collection. I felt rage burn through me. For years, Douglas had controlled every narrative, and now he was trying to control truth itself. But this time, I had the real evidence. I have my own DNA test results, I said clearly, pulling a sealed envelope from my bag. These confirm that James Blackwell is my biological father, which makes me Eleanor's blood granddaughter, the only one at this table. The room erupted in murmurs. My mother's eyes filled with tears. James, seated at the far end of the table, gave a quiet nod. Douglas's face twisted with fury. This is a manipulation, he shouted. An attempt to steal what's rightfully mine. But before Harrison could respond, James stood. Douglas, he said evenly, if we're going to discuss bloodlines, then perhaps we should start with the truth about yours. The room fell silent. James's voice was calm but cutting. You were adopted. Our parents brought you into the family after years of trying to conceive. You're not a biological Blackwell. Gasps broke out around the table. Douglas went pale. That's a lie, he hissed. James reached into his briefcase and laid out 2 documents, one old, yellowed adoption record, and a recent DNA analysis. These prove it. You are not descended from Harold Blackwell. I am, and by extension, so is Jennifer. For a moment, Douglas just stared at the papers, the final unraveling of the identity he'd built his life around. This is absurd, he muttered, his voice cracking. Is it? I asked quietly. You said only blood relatives deserve the Blackwell fortune. Will you stand by your word now? His face contorted in rage, but before he could respond, the heavy double doors creaked open. Bernard Walsh, frail, pale, but very much alive, entered the room, leaning on a cane. Apologies for my delay, he said, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. But I believe my presence is required. The sight of him made Harrison blanch. Whatever scheme Douglas had orchestrated was collapsing. Bernard sat, unfolding a sealed envelope embossed with the Blackwell crest. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwell left instructions for this to be read only if questions of lineage arose. He looked up, eyes gleaming. I believe that time has come. Bernard's voice carried the calm weight of authority, the kind that silenced a room not through volume, but through certainty. He unfolded the heavy cream-colored paper, its edges worn as if it had been handled many times before, perhaps by my grandmother herself in her final months. Every eye in the room was fixed on him as he began to read aloud. To my family gathered here today, if this letter is being read, it means the truth I have guarded for decades has finally come to light. I have always known that Douglas was not born of Blackwell blood. He was adopted by my husband and me after years of heartbreak and loss. He was loved, raised, and educated as a Blackwell, and in every way that mattered. He was my son. But blood, I have learned, carries both power and poison. I also know and have long known that Jennifer is the daughter of James, my true son. From the first moment I held her, I felt my father's blood alive again in her eyes. A grandmother always knows her own. Gasps rippled through the room. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Douglas sat perfectly still, a faint tremor in his jaw, the only sign that he'd even heard. Bernard continued reading, his voice unwavering. The Blackwell Trust, established by my father, was written in an era obsessed with legacy and lineage. It binds the estate to direct blood descendants, and though that condition once seemed fair, it has also sown bitterness through generations. I have therefore restructured my personal estate, which constitutes the majority of our family fortune, to reflect not outdated rules of biology, but the values of character and truth. To Douglas, you have been my son in every sense but blood, yet your pride, your cruelty, and your treatment of your niece, your brother's child, have shown me a heart corrupted by greed. You sought to disinherit her by weaponizing blood, and in doing so, you have disinherited yourself. To James and Jennifer, my true heirs, may you rebuild what arrogance and secrecy have destroyed. You are the continuation of what is good in this family, not through wealth, but through integrity. Bernard lowered the letter, his gaze sweeping across the room. In accordance with Eleanor Blackwell's final instructions, the assets tied to the original Blackwell Trust, those requiring direct bloodline descent, passed to James Blackwell and his biological daughter, Jennifer. The remainder of Eleanor's personal estate will be distributed as outlined in her will. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Douglas exploded. He shot up from his chair, slamming his fist against the table. "You can't do this! This is manipulation." "Lies, I am a Blackwell. I've built this family's name." Bernard didn't even flinch. "You built nothing, Douglas," he said evenly. "You maintained what was given to you under false pretenses. Your mother Eleanor knew this truth and forgave you long ago, but she also foresaw your downfall." Douglas turned to me, his eyes wild. "You promised," he shouted. You said only blood relatives deserve the fortune." I met his gaze, the man who'd spent his life reminding me I didn't belong. "No," I said quietly. "You said that. I just asked if you'd keep your word." For a moment, he looked like he might lunge across the table. But then the fight drained out of him all at once, replaced by something hollow: defeat. He sank back into his chair, staring at nothing. Harrison Mills sat frozen beside him, his professional mask cracked. Bernard turned his sharp eyes toward him. "Mr. Mills," he said slowly, "I have evidence that you were aware of Douglas's adoption and deliberately concealed it to manipulate the trust. I will be forwarding my findings to the state bar." The color drained from Harrison's face. "Save it," Bernard said curtly. "You've done enough harm." When the formalities ended, people began to disperse, some whispering, others too stunned to speak. My brothers stayed behind, lingering uncertainly by the door. Thomas was the first to approach. His voice trembled slightly. "Jen, I had no idea." "I know," I said gently. "None of this is your fault." William nodded, his expression solemn. "For what it's worth, you've always been our sister. That doesn't change." Their words softened something inside me. For so long, I'd seen them as extensions of Douglas, his reflections. But now, I saw two men caught between loyalty and truth, just as I had been for most of my life. When they left, I turned toward my mother. She looked exhausted, relieved, and unbearably sad. "I should have told you years ago," she whispered. "You deserve to know the truth." "You were trying to protect me," I said, though my voice wavered. "I understand that now. But secrets always find their way out, don't they?" Her eyes shimmered with tears. "They do. And sometimes they destroy everything, but sometimes they set us free." Later that evening, the mansion was quiet again, the chaos fading into distant echoes. James and I sat in grandmother's study, the same place where this story began, surrounded by the scent of old paper and polished wood. The fire crackled softly between us. He looked at me with a tenderness I'd never known from any father figure. "What will you do now?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "Build something new, something honest." He nodded slowly. "You remind me of her, Eleanor. The way she never let this family's legacy define her. She believed in strength through truth, not power through name." I looked up at her portrait above the mantel, her calm eyes, her faint smile. "I think she knew this day would come," I said softly. "She planned everything perfectly." James chuckled quietly. "That sounds like her." In the weeks that followed, the news of the Blackwell scandal rippled through the city's elite circles. Douglas retreated into isolation, his reputation destroyed, his fortune diminished. Harrison resigned from his firm, citing health issues. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care about gossip or wealth or legacy. I cared about truth. James and I began to rebuild slowly, cautiously, a relationship that had been stolen from us by silence. We spent long evenings sharing stories of Eleanor, of my mother, of what it meant to carry both her blood and her spirit. One night, as we sat in the garden she had loved, James said quietly, "You know, Jennifer, Eleanor used to tell me that blood only matters if it carries kindness. Otherwise, it's just red water." I smiled, tears stinging my eyes. She was right. As the wind stirred the autumn leaves around us, I felt her presence warm, approving, proud. My story hadn't ended with betrayal, it had ended with clarity, with family rediscovered, and justice restored. Douglas had spent his entire life insisting that I wasn't a real Blackwell, and in the end, he was right not in the way he thought, but in the way that mattered most. Because I wasn't defined by the Blackwell name, I was defined by truth and by the blood that beat, honestly and fiercely, in my own heart. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true life tales of betrayal, family secrets, and redemption. Tell me in the comments what would you have done if you discovered your whole life was built on a lie.